Welcome to Daily Drive for Monday, December 22nd, 2025. I'm Kellen Walker in Las Vegas. Today on the show, we kick off our series of year-end conversations about each corner of the automotive industry in 2025. Today, we're kicking things off with our Automotive News Automaker team. In this conversation, I talk with Nick Bunkley, Director of Automaker Coverage at Automotive News, Stellantis reporter Vince Bond Jr., GM reporter Lindsay Van Hully, Ford reporter Michael Martinez, and VW Group reporter Jack Walsworth. Nick, as the editor overseeing the automaker coverage, give us a 30,000-foot view. What defined 2025 for the auto industry? What were the dominant themes you saw across all these companies?
I think it starts with two words that begin with T, and that's tariffs and Trump, who put those tariffs in place. And that sort of filtered through the entire industry all year long. It was the whole year of first preparing for that, and then once the tariffs started in April, seeing all these automakers deal with them in various ways, whether that's reducing imports, dropping some nameplates, investing in U.S. manufacturing, even though that's not going to happen for a couple more years down the road. It was just a year spent trying to navigate this environment with the change of administration.
And in your opinion, Nick, which automaker had the best year and which had the worst?
Well, despite all that chaos, I mean, the whole industry didn't have a real bad year. Sales are looking okay. And so GM, I would point out, had a pretty good year, even though they had a few $1 billion worth of tariff costs. They still continued to pile up profits, and so you can't say that was a bad year for them. And then on the other side of things, again, it wasn't a terrible year by any stretch for Ford, but they definitely had some issues with quality and set a record for a number of recalls, which, of course, is the kind of record you don't want to be setting in this business.
All right, so let's then get into a little bit of Trump's trade war and manufacturing. Trump's tariffs dominated the year. Let's talk about how each company responded. And Lindsay, let's start with you. How much did tariffs cost GM and how did they respond?
Well, in the beginning of the year, they were talking about $4 to $5 billion, which is a pretty significant impact. As of October, when they had their most recent earnings call, they were thinking now that was going to decline to about $3.5 billion to $4.5 billion. There's some offsets that are out there that are going to help, related just to bringing down that overall impact. But I think still it's pretty significant. They've talked about being able to offset at least 30% of it, and a big reason for that, I think, that they're pointing to is really, it was sort of alluded to earlier, just more U.S. manufacturing, trying to shift some nameplates back to the U.S., increase production of others here, really trying to offset that as best they can. But their exposure is is pretty significant. They have a lot of manufacturing in Mexico. They have a couple of their most affordable nameplates that are imported from South Korea. The Buick Envision comes from China. So there's a pretty big impact. But one of the things that they haven't really done is stop production of any of those. They've said they're continuing to ship the Chevy Trax and the Buick Envista, the really the lowest end of their portfolio, the most affordable subcompacts that they have, because it is at a price point that's really needed in the market right now. And so I think what we've seen from GM and a lot of other automakers that I'm sure my colleagues will talk about is just really absorbing a lot of that impact right now into the bottom line, and not necessarily raising those prices across the board.
Vince, how about Stellantis? They had a wave of investments announced this year. What's going on over there, and how were they affected by tariffs?
Yeah, well, Stellantis has some major changes directly due to the tariffs. First off, they had to drop the Italian-built Dodge Hornet, the small crossover they had just put out like 2 years ago. It wasn't really doing a lot of volume, but it was just a way for Dodge to try to expand their reach and get a new audience. And even though it wasn't selling well, I mean, they did have another vehicle out there if somebody wanted to get an entry-level Dodge. And so that model is no longer being produced right now. And then following that, they had to drop the base trim of the Charger Daytona RT, and that's the EV that came out in January. And so they dropped the base trim. That was around $50,000. Those weren't really selling well either, but it was just Dodge's way to try to establish an EV and its first EV really, and try to expand it in a new market. And so they lost the RT trim, they lost the Hornet, and then also they did sort of change their marketing approach a little bit as well. So when those tariffs were enacted, they put in a new employee pricing program for dealerships, just try to draw some more customers in and make them comfortable. Even with the price hikes pending, later in the year, they're hoping that maybe they can get the employee discounts in there. Consumers will feel more comfortable to, buy vehicles anyway. So those are really the main impacts for the tariffs on Stellantis.
Interesting. And we're going to move over to Ford real quick. Mike, Ford brought back employee pricing as a defensive move. Has it worked?
Kel, I would argue it was an offensive move. And I say that because coming into this, Ford was really the best positioned automaker. They build the most vehicles here in the United States. They employ the most UAW workers out of any of the companies. They love to say that in their marketing materials. So when the tariffs hit in April, they really felt it was an opportunity to go on the offensive, to get their message out there and to put some deals down to try to spur more people into the showrooms and maybe try to take away from the competition that was sort of reeling a bit with some of these cost increases. And they've had a pretty strong year from a sales perspective. They're going to sell more vehicles in 2025 than they did in 2024. And that's impressive given they don't really have a whole new lot on dealer lots right now. They have a new Expedition and Navigator, but that's really about it. So all things considered from a tariff standpoint, they did pretty well.
Gotcha. And Jack, how did European automakers like VW navigate Trump's trade war differently than other domestics?
Yeah, I'd say it was kind of a day by day. For the Europeans, a lot of them have production in Europe. Can't just move that across the Atlantic quickly. Definitely kind of a brand by brand difference. Volkswagen brand has a site in Tennessee, Mexico. Obviously, they're not as impacted as like a Porsche, who only has European facilities. One big brand was Audi. They do have a factory in Mexico, but besides that, all of their vehicles are imported. So I think for a lot of the European brands, they were put in a tough spot because they relied so heavily on imports. But even on the high end in the ultra luxury space, like the Bentleys, Lamborghinis, Ferraris, those are vehicles that are only made, in certain factories, and that's part of the heritage, part of the reason why people buy them is because they're handmade in Italy or England, things like that. So, obviously, those factories aren't going to come here, and so we saw some price increases. We saw, prices that were already super high on those high end exotics going up even higher. But the customer base is a little bit more insulated; they can kind of handle that. So definitely not a one size fits all type thing. But another thing too is the EU is a huge block of countries. The trade deal with the EU and the US that took a while to kind of get over the goal line. I think that was something that was kind of hanging over a lot of these brands throughout the summer. It was something that wasn't just realized quickly, but definitely not one size fits all. And depending on which European brand you are, probably in a better spot than others. But definitely, one of those things that can't move a factory that quickly. And we haven't seen a ton of new investment from European brands into the US. Volkswagen Group is considering an Audi plant, but that hasn't been finalized or announced. So maybe more to come into 2026, but 2025 was definitely, I'd say, logistically challenging for many of the European brands.
There's one thing we haven't talked about as far as impacts of trade. And since we're talking about the administration and some of the changes in general, I mean, you could look at, some of the changes around emissions and that have had kind of ripple effects on electric vehicle plans, and all of that kind of taken together has just made the business of product planning even more challenging, right? I think all of us sort of ran into this as we were doing some of our future product pipeline reporting this year and trying to get a sense of what's coming in the pipeline, what's on the horizon. A lot of that's just a lot more murky with uncertainty that's out there around trade policy and not knowing necessarily what deals were going to be reached and how much and when, and changes to some of the things like the tax credit for electric vehicles, for instance. And so I think one of the things that I heard throughout the year was just flexibility, right? In product planning, in powertrains, in strategies, being able to be nimble and pivot has been really important.
Coming up, Vince and Mike detail the years that Stellantis and Ford had in 2025. That's next on Daily Drive. Vince, we'll start off with you. The Stellantis turnaround. One of the biggest stories of the year, Stellantis went from crisis to comeback mode. Can you walk us through what happened?
Yeah. So really, the narrative around the company has really changed a lot. So obviously, Carlos Tavares, former CEO, he resigned in December, and Antonio Filosa, he took over in June, and he was previously the CEO or COO for North America. And so under Filosa, I mean, there's the whole narrative has changed around the company. I mean, it's gone from one of cutting costs and firing people to now they're growing, and instead of talking about EVs, they're talking about big Hemi engines and bringing back old school American muscle. And so that's really been the huge change under Filosa. They're trying to build some momentum. They've seen some gains this year under Jeep and Ram in particular. And so those are some good signs you're seeing early on.
And Vince, is part of Stellantis's turnaround, is a big part of this the refocus on North America?
Yes. So one of the big things in North America is the Hemi engine, and so that is coming back to the Ram 1500, pickup truck, the 5.7 Hemi that came back in the third quarter, and Ram already saw some big gains off of that. Those trucks are moving around in like 5 days, on average in the third quarter. So some serious momentum, from that side of it. And then also for Losa, he's making his headquarters. He's living right here in North America. That's a big shift from Tavares, who still stayed overseas in Europe. And so he's, Filosa is right here. He can talk to dealers every day, be on the ground, talk to the plants, go to the plants if he wants to. And so he's here and he's making North America the main focus.
And what do we know so far about the repair of dealer relations with the company since Antonio Filosa has taken over?
Yeah, well, that really ties back into what they're doing now, trying to build up sales. So one, the Hemi, that is something that the dealers wanted, and the brand has promised, well, the company has promised that not only will the Ram 1500 get the Hemi back, they're also going to expand that engine and bring it back to more models. So we'll see a lot more Jeeps with Hemis in them, and maybe some other brands will get that performance boost from that engine. The Hemi fan base is very vocal. They've been clamoring for it to come back, and so Stellantis is listening, with Tavares, and that's also going to please dealers at the same time. And another thing I would say is just, Filosa is really just being, I guess, collaborative with dealers. That's one of the big things, and he's listening to what they want to do in this market. Before he came in, they were really hoping for someone that was going to just listen to them and just kind of give more detail on what's needed on in this market, not Europe. And so far, Filosa is delivering, and he's doing what they want them, what dealers want him to do.
Perfect. Thanks, Vince. Now, Mike, Ford had a record-breaking year for recalls. What happened?
Yeah, they had the record-breaking year halfway through the year, so it's really impressive in terms of the ineptitude and the inability to properly build a vehicle, so to speak. But I think the company would point to a few things, one of them being the fact that this isn't a new issue. This has been a problem for years, and they are addressing it by implementing stricter quality checks. So if you have a lot more testing going on and you're catching more things, that's going to lead to more recalls. So that's why they're saying the number jumped so substantially this year. And at the same time, too, they point to software issues. Ford's made it a point to really expand its subscription services, and for all brands, vehicles are getting way more technical. And Ford's saying at least around half of these recalls, over 100 at this point, are software related that can be fixed relatively easily with an over-the-air update versus bringing it into a dealer and having them need to wrench on your car for a week. So that's why they would say the numbers are so high. It's still not good. Again, I mentioned this is an issue that's been plaguing the automaker for years. Jim Farley said a couple years ago that he let this fester too long when he first became CEO in 2020, and he wishes he would have acted faster. But we're starting to see some of those actions take root in 2025 and hopefully lead to some better numbers moving forward. So, Kel, for all the criticism that Ford has gotten, probably rightly, for their quality woes, it should be noted that they have made some improvements this year. And I had mentioned earlier additional testing, and we've seen situations where now instead of testing a certain part to a certain time frame, they're now testing to failure. And sometimes that leads to delays in product launches. We saw that with the Super Duty redesign a few years ago. But ultimately, Ford says it's going to lead to fewer recalls on those vehicles once they get out there. We did a story earlier this year about how they've implemented artificial intelligence on the assembly line to scan vehicles as they're going through and catch defects sooner, so they don't have to wait until the end to take cars apart. They can just catch it right there and keep the line moving. So things are going well. We saw them receive the best positioning in a recent JD Power quality survey that they've had in a really long time. To be fair, they were number 11, so nobody's popping champagne to be number 11. That doesn't mean you came in first twice. So they have some work to do. But Ford says one metric they look at is vehicles after 3 months in service, when they're the freshest coming out of the factories. And they say they're going to have their best 3 months in service internal scores that they've had in decades. So there's a sign that maybe things aren't great right now, but they are slowly getting better.
And some other big Ford news, the headquarters move. Now, was that a symbolic thing, or does this actually change how Ford operates?
I think you could argue it was symbolic, but also practical at the same time. If you've been into the glass house in Dearborn, you know it's not a great building. I think any worker that has spent any amount of time there recently is jumping for joy at the fact that they get to leave that building and that it will be demolished and no longer exist a few years from now. But it's also symbolic in that the executives want to get closer to where the action is. They don't want to have to walk from their glass tower to a parking lot, drive 10 minutes somewhere else in Dearborn to an engineering building, and then go into a meeting room. They don't want to have to spend half the day trying to get to a design studio. So by co-locating everybody in one space, you should remember that Ford was already building this building as part of a campus renovation plan they announced a decade ago. They were going to have it there anyway. Jim Farley, everybody else decided, hey, we should be there right with the rest of our employees. We can get work done a lot more efficiently. Maybe the employees might not like that. If your boss is looking over your shoulder every day, that may not be the best thing, but they hope it will lead to more efficiencies in terms of how they work.
And you brought up how now everyone will essentially be under one roof. How big of a cultural shift do you think that'll be with now executives down the hallway from engineers?
I think Ford's been going through a cultural shift for a few years now, just like many of these other companies, hiring a lot of talent from Silicon Valley. Obviously, the big shift during COVID with remote work, and you have a bunch of folks in California now that are beaming in for presentations and meetings. So I think culturally, there's been a change that's been happening, but I think this really accelerates that. Ford sort of pivoted by bringing everybody back to their desks, to their offices 5 days a week from that COVID era remote work policy. So workers are getting used to that, but Ford argues that it's a good thing that you get more ideas, that work gets done faster. And then again, if you have the bosses there, they can, in an ideal world, sign off on projects quicker and bring new vehicles to market at a faster rate.
Vince Bond Jr. and Michael Martinez cover Ford and Stellantis for us at Automotive News. Come back tomorrow for a look at the years that GM and VW had in 2025. That's Daily Drive for today. I'm Kellen Walker. Thanks to Automotive News executive producer Jake Neer for his help on today's podcast. You can get the latest news on manufacturing, tariffs, and everything happening in the auto industry at autonews.com. We'd love to hear from you. Let us know what you think of the show and the topics we covered today. Send us an email at dailydrive@autonews.com or leave us a voicemail at 313-444-2774. And if you enjoyed the podcast, remember to like, leave a review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode.